Okay, picking back up where we left off, two U.S. Army Air Forces advisors working with the tribes in the exercise area staged a pre-dawn attack using firefight packages along with a team of Ghanaian Army Special Forces who were told that they were on a training exercise. The villagers were told this was a hostile attack, and the chieftain dutifully reported subversive insurgency to the district police headquarters in the nearest town. The news spread to the capital, and this sector was reported to be in rebellion. General Aliciato's field headquarters reported they would put down the trouble and that all would be under control. The increased activity was overlooked in the capital as one of those occasional native outbreaks. Then, under the cover of this emergency, the incumbent government was served with an ultimatum. A well-armed force of paratroopers disembarked at the main airport and began to take over the national radio station and other government centers. Since they were heavily armed, the president assumed that they included men upon whom had relied and who had the keys to the ammunition magazines. He called in the United States CIA friend who reluctantly confirmed that this was the case and that safe passage could be arranged for the president and his immediate family in a Fawcett Airlines plane, which happened to be at the airport in a matter of hours. The old president was on his way, and a courier drove onto the Ghanaian Air Force Base to inform the major that he could prepare Aliciato for his victory march into the capital and to the presidential palace. We got deer back here? Maybe. Aliciato served his country for several years, and he may have been replaced in the same manner. Meanwhile, the major has left four other duties. If the general had had the opportunity to visit the Guatemalan airfield, which was constructed on the ranch at Ratahuleu for the purpose of training Cuban air crews, he would have seen his old friend the major busy with those ex-Cuban airline pilots, trying to teach them how to fly the latest and most lethal model of the old B-26. Or he could have seen the major a while later at his primary support base in Arizona, where T-28s and other aircraft were being outfitted for Laos. Such men are members of a small and highly competent group of professionals who prepare the way for the operations dreamed up by the secret team and any part of the world, in any part of the world. The real day-to-day operational work of the secret team and of its principal action organization, the CIA, is so different from that of any ordinary arm of the government that it would be worth the time and space here to define and explain it as it is revealed in the scenes just outlined. The coup d'etat described was a composite of real ones, although the name of the countries involved and the name of the general are changed. Oddly enough, the general did become president after an all-night party, and the major did have his hands full trying to get him ready for his victorious entry into town. The CIA had a full-time man in the embassy who was responsible for what might be called routine intelligence. It was noted that there was increasing opposition to the incumbent president, so an agency man was introduced into the country as an army colonel. He was a special forces officer and well known in the U.S. Army as an instructor at Fort Bragg. Actually, he had been at Fort Bragg in the John F. Kennedy Center on a CIA cover assignment. He had been in the Army during the World War II, and he had a bona fide reserve commission. Technically, He was recalled to active duty, but he was paid by the CIA, and he was not on basic Army roles except as a cover assignment. This When this special requirement in Gandia arose, the CIA got him transferred to the Army mission in Gandia by suggesting that the incumbent Army colonel be called back to attend the National War College. This excuse satisfied the Army headquarters in Panama and enabled the cover colonel to take over the mission without delay. No sooner had this colonel reported for duty than the ambassador began a build-up program for him so that he would have a chance to meet the president frequently and to talk with him sufficiently to win over the U.S. Army doctrine on civic action and to convince him that this could be applied to the rebellious areas in the border outposts. In this manner, he became a confidant of the president and was very useful later during the coup d'etat. At about the same time, the Army colonel arrived in Gandia, and an American businessman who was president of a small independent airline with its main offices in Panama came into the capital city to open a one-man office and to represent his airline. He rented a small piece of space at the airport and hired a clerk and a young man who had been working with the well-known Latin American airline, Fawcett Airways, ostensibly to assure the success of his new venture. This man remained in Gandia for several months and visited all major companies in in an attempt to sell them special air services with his company by using small aircraft and one or two World War II flying boat PBYs could provide for them. He became a regular figure in the town and was expected as a hard-working, friendly businessman who knew Latin America and who could speak fluent Spanish. Otherwise, he stayed in the background and was rarely seen in the official American community. He seemed to know no one at the embassy, and they were never seen with him. He was gathering intelligence, and he was an old professional. He had a drop for routine messages, which the agency communications man sent through the special CIA transmitter in the embassy. But even the CIA people in Gandia did not know that he had his own network of highly classified messages out of Pagon. He would fly there frequently so that when he had important messages, his sudden departure would not be noticed by the Gandians or the Americans. Meanwhile, the U.S. Air Force major had been introduced through Air Force channels. He was technically an overage in Gandia and was carried on temporary duty status there for the duration of the civic action exercises, which were scheduled to last throughout the year. He was assigned to the U.S. Air Force Special Air Warfare Unit in Panama. He was a longtime CIA employee who had served in many countries and was one of their best career pilots and black flight specialists. Although firm intelligence had shown the possibility that the old president was apt to be overthrown because of the incipient. Damn, I rarely ever read that word. Although firm intelligence has shown the possibility that the old president was apt to be overthrown because of incipient developments, there were no reliable indications which would identify a possible successor. This left the agency with the operation of waiting to see who might rise to power by his own ability, or of stepping in with an attempt to create a man who could take over when the president's position became dangerously weakened. The former choice was poor because it left the door open for other interests, always considered to be Castroite or communist. to step in with their own man, since the agency believed the fall of the present government to be about as certain as such a thing can be. It was decided to use the Mag-Say-Say formula and to create the next president by making him the hero of the people throughout the country as a first step. It would be the job of the major to groom the man they had selected for the role. The major did not know the American businessman who was president of the small airline, and he never came across him during his agency career. The airline president did not know him either. The agency planned to keep them working independently so that it could cross-check their reports. The major had met the Army colonel during airdrop exercises at Fort Bragg, but he thought he was a real Army Special Air Forces instructor and did not know that he too was a CIA career man. The agency gave him clearance to work with the colonel very closely and cleared the colonel similarly. The major did not know of the colonel's role with the president, and the colonel did not know the major's assignment. Each man was to play his role straight. The ambassador was fully informed of the agency's plan, since he was the recipient of its secret intelligence reports, and he knew that one of the men in his communications room was an agency man. He had never made an attempt to determine which man it was because he thought his charge d'affaires knew French. Also, it would be better for him to keep his fingers out of that kind of thing. He did not know that the major, the colonel, and the airline president were CIA men. He did not see their message traffic, although the agency took pains to make sure that he received cleaned copies of their dispatches, which he assumed had been culled from attaché reports and other more or less normal sources. The ambassador was not interested in intelligence. He had been in the country only 1 year, and if he could keep things calm, he hoped to be transferred at the end of the second year. He was a political appointee and not a career man. The major spent a considerable amount of time setting up elaborate civic action exercises in all areas of the country. These were staged like carnivals, and at the climax of every operation, General Elisiato would fly in and address the village and local tribesmen. There had been a few native uprisings, and some operations were directed into those areas to impress the villagers with the power of the new Air Force. The major found a few villages that lived in fear of bandit tribes. Here he took a page from the Mag-Say-Say book and rigged some early morning attacks by what he called the Red Team. These attacks were always repulsed by a Blue Team, which just happened to be in the area. In every case, Elisiato would show up leading the victorious anti-guerrillas. The unwitting natives took this as the real thing, and the fame of General Elisiato as the greatest guerrilla fighter since Simon Bolivar spread throughout the country. This kind of script calls for the utilization of equipment borrowed from the U.S. Armed Forces along with personnel to carry out such missions. It also calls for the liberal use of a blank checkbook, which the general is urged to use to win over those who might be useful. Up to this stage of action, most of what the CIA had been doing falls in the category of intelligence, with only a preparatory stage of clandestine operations. As its agency reports a worsening position for the old president and general disillusionment on the part of key businessmen and other leaders, along with a growing national awareness of General Elisiato, Western Hemisphere Division puts together the outline of a proposed operation to be briefed to the Deputy Director of Plans, Clandestine Services, and thence to the Department of Counterintelligence. Following this briefing, and with the approval of these men, the agency will brief selected key people in defense and state to see how they feel about the situation and whether or not they are ready to see a change of government in Guyana. Throughout this period, the agency will have been sending special messages to its man in the embassy. He will use these to brief the ambassador, or perhaps to have the Army colonel brief the ambassador to guide him in this situation. Some of the very messages the agency will have sent to Gandia will come back over the embassy network as an intelligence input, and at the same time will be transmitted by the attaches to the Defense Department. Thus, a wave of messages and corroborating one another will fill in baskets in State, Defense, and the White House. In his role as intelligence coordinator, and the Department of Counterintelligence will prepare his own analysis for all of this and will prepare to place this business on the agenda of the next National Security Council Special Group meeting. He will present the current situation only and propose a special operation. By this time, the agency and a number of the secret team operatives will have just about decided that the only thing to do in Gandia is to go along with General Aliciado and permit him to exploit the situation. They have convinced themselves that if the government is that shaky in the first place, they had better be on the winning side rather than on the communists. A special group meeting will be held, and the designated substitute for each National Security Council member will attend. The consensus of the meeting will be to go ahead with the Major's program, but to hold up until each member has an opportunity to inform his principal of the action. The Department of Counterintelligence will offer to visit the President and will get his approval. This makes the visit to the Secretary of State and his Secretary of Defense purely informational. This account of developments may seem somewhat unreal. Anyone who has carefully read the Pentagon Papers will recognize most of the above. In fact, most people who have read the Pentagon Papers will see that this is what was done in the case of the Diems in South Vietnam. The significant point is that the CIA may have sent the Major to Gandia in the first place, simply to see how things were going there and perhaps to have him ready for action in a neighboring country if needed. But the Major is an old firehorse, and when he hears the bell, he cannot help getting into harness. The scenario is somewhat like the movie Fahrenheit 451, in which the firemen were the men who started the fires rather than the men who put them out. It is so easy to topple over a government in most small countries simply by finding the key control. If all arms and equipment are kept under close control, then the armed forces and the police have few useful weapons at any given time. Thus, if the leader of a rebellion all of a sudden shows up with a large and unaccounted for supply of weapons, he might be able to take the government over without a shot simply by the fact that he has them outgunned before the start. Thus, it is not too difficult for a man with boundless resources such as the Major could command to be able to arrange things almost effortlessly. At that point, all he has to know, and all the men he is supporting has to know, is that the United States will not make a move to support the incumbent. Then, when the tide begins to turn, the incumbent finds himself alone with no one in a position to help him. Like so many things the secret team does, this is more a negative coup d'etat than a positive action. It is not to be presumed that a program such as this can be fully implemented in a short time, or that it is set in motion with the objective of causing and supporting a coup d'etat. As a matter of fact, the characteristic of the secret team that supersedes all others in such a situation as this is that events... Wait a minute. As a matter of fact, the characteristic of the secret team supersedes all others in such a situation as this is, that events should take their natural course, with some covert help. A document that was circulated from the CIA through other government agencies and extra-governmental organizations such as the RAND Corporation and the Institute for Defense Analysis shows how this is done. Once a country is included on the counterinsurgency list or any other such category, a move is made to develop a CIA echelon, usually within the structure of whatever U.S. military organization exists there at the time. Then the CIA operations begin Phase 1 by proposing the introduction of some rather conventional aircraft. No developing country can resist such an offer, and this serves to create a base of operations, usually in a remote and potentially hostile area. While the aircraft program is getting started, the agency will set up a high-frequency radio network using radios positioned in villages throughout the host country. The local inhabitants are told that these radios will provide a warning of guerrilla activity. Phase 2 of such a project calls for the introduction of medium transport type aircraft that meet anti-guerrilla warcraft support requirements. The crew training program continues, and every effort is made to develop the in-house maintenance capability. As the level of this activity increases, more and more Americans are brought in, ostensibly as instructors and advisors. At this phase, many of the Americans are Army Special Forces personnel who begin civic action programs. The country is sold the idea that it is the Army in most developing nations that is the usual stabilizing influence, and that it is the Army that can be trusted. This is the American doctrine, promoting the same idea, but in other words, it is a near paraphrase of the words of Chairman Mao. In the final phase of this effort, light transports and liaison-type aircraft are introduced to be used for border surveillance, landing in remote areas, and for resupplying small groups of anti-guerrilla warfare troops who are operating away from fixed bases. These small specialized aircraft are usually augmented by helicopters. When the plan has developed this far, efforts are made to spread the program throughout the frontier area of the country. Villagers are encouraged to clear off small runways or helicopter landing pads, and more warning network radios are brought into remote areas. While this work is continuing, the government is told that these activities will develop their own military capability and that there will be a bonus economic benefit from such development, each complementing the other. It also makes the central government able to contact in areas which it may never have been able to operate before, and it will serve as a tripwire warning system for any guerrilla activities that may arise in the area. There is no question at this whole there is no question that this whole political, economic, social program sounds very nice, and most host governments have taken the bait eagerly. What they do not realize, and in many cases what most of the U.S. government do not realize, is that this is a CIA program, and it exists to develop intelligence. If it stopped there, it might be acceptable, but intelligence serves as its own propellant, and before long, the agents working on this type of project see, or perhaps are a factor in creating internal dissension, or that they may find areas of ancient border conflicts, or they may run into some legitimate probing and prodding from a neighboring country, which may or may not have its origins in Moscow, just as our program had its origins in Washington. In any event, the intelligence operator at this point begins to propose operations, and these clandestine operations lead to minor Vietnams or other such bleeding ulcer-type projects that drain the United States resources, wealth, and manpower on behalf of no meaningful national objectives. I need something to drink. Excuse many national objectives, people. The CIA maintains hundreds of U.S. military units for its own purposes. Many of these units become involved in this type of operation. After these cover units have been in existence for several years, the military has a hard time keeping track of them. The military system is prone to try to ignore such abnormalities, and the CIA capitalizes on this to bury some units deep in the military wasteland. The CIA also maintains countless paramilitaries, pseudo-business organizations that weave in and out of legitimacy and do business much as their civilian counterparts would. The small airline alluded to in the Ghanaian example actually exists and very capably operates in Latin America. It operates as a viable business and competes with other airlines of its type. The only difference is that the officials of the other airlines, who have a hard time meeting the payroll at times, wonder how their competition is able to stay in business year after year with no more volume than they have. At such a point, most of the competition will rationalize that the cover airline must be in some illegitimate business like smuggling and the drug traffic, or else that it is connected with the CIA. That could be right on both accounts. Most of these cover businesses have to be closed out and reestablished from time to time to support their usefulness. It may be interesting to note that in September 1963, none other than the Secretary of the Senate, Bobby Baker, got mixed up with one of these cover airlines, Fairways Incorporated, without knowing it, and that the exposure resulting from his accidental charter of this small airline played a part in bringing down his house of cards. Part of the Ghanaian coup d'etat demonstrates that the ambassador will be briefed on most things that happen in his country, and if he is alert and insistent, he may be on top of most of the things the secret team is doing there. In actual practice, however, there may be quite a bit of communications traffic that he will know nothing about. The CIA will have its own communications network, and in addition to that, agents who come and go will be sending messages outside of the country that he may never know about. It would be an unusually adept ambassador who would catch all of the byplay in the incoming messages and the outgoing traffic. Most ambassadors would be surprised to learn that some of the staff messages that are proposed to them for authorization to transmit were received from the secret team almost verbatim in the form which his staff are given him to send back to Washington. This is a useful device for the secret team because it gets messages of unquestioned authority from the ambassador into the Department of State and usually into the defense via attaché channels. By this innocent appearing device, the secret team is able to create intelligence inputs that are then used for clandestine operations feedback. This becomes a possible ploy because the team can separate people who know about the outgoing messages from those who know about the incoming messages by such need-to-know and eyes-only restrictive methods. Such methods are not completely used, but they are used when someone on the secret team feels that the desired end will justify the means. In this example, we saw that the agency had operatives working in Gambia who were unaware of each other's presence. It is entirely possible that the ambassador may not have known either that all of the CIA men were working on this project were CIA men. He would have had available to him a list of all Americans in Gambia if he had wanted to research it, but in operational exercises such as this, it is most likely that he would not know all the agents. This is a most touchy area. And there have been times when the CIA's own chief of station, its senior man in the country, was not aware of the fact that other CIA men were working in his country. This can create some very complex problems. In one case of record, it resulted in a very serious altercation between two CIA factions, with the result that the chief of station demanded that the other men leave or that he would leave. In that instance, the chief of station left. Another way the secret team gets around the special operative problem is to employ non-U.S. citizens to assist in countries where Another way the secret team gets around the special operative problem is to employ non-U.S. citizens to assist in countries where an over-scrupulous ambassador or cautious chief of station have given trouble. A number of such personnel have been used by the CIA in Indochina in varieties of roles, and in some exceptional cases, they have been used on special assignments in Latin America. The Ghanaian incident shows another special facility in the hands of the secret team. In order to equip General Elisiato with an abundance of arms and ammunition, the CIA arranged with the Air Force to airlift these munitions to a remote site. In order to do this, the two large C-130 aircraft had to depart from the U.S. Air Force Base in Panama with cargo manifests that showed only the actual cargo that was being delivered to the final destination in the capital of Pagon. This meant that a deal had to be made with customs in order to get out of Panama. The landing in Pagon had to be clandestine, and the chance of discovery had to be gambled. There have been incidents where such illicit cargo drops were made and then discovered before they could be picked up. In such cases, the cargo had to be abandoned, and the finder was so much richer. The U.S. government could not make a move to identify itself as owner of the property. The pickup flights also had to be clandestine in that they left Gandia and entered Pagon without clearance or a flight plan, made their landing, pickup, and return with non-manifested cargo in Gandia. This part of the operation may not seem important, but there should have been exposure of any of those illicit flights. It could have led to the exposure of the entire plot, and the coup d'etat by the opposite side may have taken place, or the old president may have had sufficient warning to take strong measures to remain in power. Certainly, if he did learn of this business, he would no longer be a friend of the United States. We have mentioned the Magsaysay incident before. The way in which the secret team was able to build up Magsaysay from an unknown army captain to a national hero and eventually to president was so appealing that the technique has been attempted in other countries. One of the gambles with that game is that a situation has to be developed, preferably in some remote area, where it can be alleged that there is a pro-communist activity. In the case in point, Huck communist sympathizers' activities. In the beginning, there may be an incipient outbreak of banditry caused by crop damage or other hardship. The natives will attack other villages for food and other plunder, usually for the sole purpose of staying alive. As this situation continues and spreads, it will come to the attention of the National Police or the Border Patrol. They may not have the means to cope with the uprising and may ask the government to help them. At this point, the armed forces may recall their civic action training at Fort Bragg or in Panama, and they may ask the U.S. military mission personnel to assist them. No country likes to admit that it has some internal problems, so they quite readily call the banditry subversive insurgency. They imply that it may be communist-inspired. This puts the flame to the wick. Nothing will get a rise out of Special Forces, both Army and Air Force, faster. In short order, they will be on the spot to see what can be done. And in every case, the CIA will have men seated in the units. At this point, this is still a CIA effort, and it may stay in that category as far as the secret team is concerned until the disorders have receded or have flared higher. Usually, the break point occurs when it is discovered that the rioting is being blamed upon the incumbent administration. Then the CIA looks for the possibility of a coup. From there on, it is the familiar pattern. Such events, and there have been so many during the past 15 to 20 years, show how easily intelligence becomes clandestine operations, and how clandestine operations are usually the result of a reaction or a response mechanism and are not part of any planning or policy. This is the great danger. The leaders of the CIA and important members of the secret team have protested countless times that the CIA does not enter into policy making. In this, they are correct on most counts. The problem lies in the fact that they are not policy making, and on top of that, the operations they carry out are not in support of policy either. They simply grow like topsy, arising out of a feedback from intelligence data inputs. In some cases, there is no reason at all for the action. In other words, there may be no national objective other than the loose coverall or blanket observation that the operation is anti-communist. Another special arena in which the secret team excels is that of logistics support of clandestine operations. They always seem to operate out of a boundless horn of plenty. In the Gandhian example, the CIA was able to call for and have delivered a large quantity of munitions, and to have it delivered in heavy aircraft, all of which cost someone a lot of money. We shall have a general discussion of logistics support in a later chapter, and will not go into detail here, but it should be noted that it is one thing to be able to move such a cargo in and out of various countries without customs and other controls, and it is another thing to get the cargo in the first place. Most of us have been led to believe that the armed forces are required to account for each and every item they have procured with the taxpayer's dollar. Then how does the CIA manage to get so much so easily? All munitions have to be transferred from control depots to transport points, and all such transactions are under control and regulation. To get around this, the secret team has developed a system of its own storage depots and has them so interlaced with the military system that not even the military can track down some of the transactions. These transactions are often written off with comment. It's all in the government. But there is one area of imbalance that adds appreciably to the cost of such extracurricular activities. In the foreign aid program, there are very careful balances in aid maintenance between different countries, especially neighboring countries or countries in the same sphere of influence. If we give one country a new series of army tanks, then we must be prepared to give the neighbor the same. This will repeat itself like a row of dominoes, and the next thing we know, we have to re-equip a whole series of countries with newer equipment, because we started with one. This situation is expensive, and it is hard to control. A delivery to Pakistan of equipment not delivered to India will set off a most unpleasant round of talks with India. During India's border problem in 1962, offers were made to deliver a large shipment of arms to India. Although Pakistan was also involved to a lesser degree in the border problem, this was forgotten in the argument over the imbalance with the former delivery would create between India and Pakistan. In the end, Pakistan did increase its contact with China and became less friendly to the United States, of course. Sure, I'll take your stuff. The system is very complicated, and few would have the temerity to intervene with it. However, the CIA has from time to time created situations where munitions delivered to one country ostensibly for a clandestine operation have ended up in the hands of the central government and have created a gross imbalance within the same sphere. An example of this occurred after the Bay of Pigs operation, when Nicaragua took possession of aircraft and other valuable munitions that had been stockpiled at Puerto Cabezas and had not been used. The advanced model of the B-26 bomber being prepared for the use of the Cubans was a much more lethal aircraft than any neighbor of Nicaragua had in its own inventory. This set off a whole round of arguments about increasing the aircraft inventory of the other countries. Though these examples are limited and incomplete, they serve to point out the nature of clandestine operations. The principal reason why the creation of the CIA within the framework of our free society has caused a very serious problem is because the intelligence function, as it has been operating under the Department of Counterintelligence and the rest of the community, almost inevitably leads to clandestine operations. The law intended otherwise, but general practice during the past 25 years has served to erode the barriers between intelligence and clandestine operations to the point where today this type of thing, unfortunately, has become rather commonplace. And why has it become rather commonplace? The most basic reason is because nations' ills of all kinds are highlighted by instant global communications, and they are generally attributed to the communist boogeyman. This is not to say, of course, that some ills may not be caused by communist pressures, just as some are caused by American pressures. In fact, the benefits of being charged with so many actions are so tremendous for the men in the Kremlin that they would be less than skillful if they did not stir up a few obvious cases now and then to keep the pot boiling. When a small contribution to the efforts in Indochina on the part of the men in the Kremlin can get 50,000 Americans killed and $200 billion wasted versus no Russians killed and only a few $1 billion invested, the Kremlin cannot be blamed for using this tactic to its advantage. And who's really pulling the strings in our government? Are they communists? Are they Nazis? Or are they both? In the Philippines, lumbering interests and major sugar interests have forced tens of thousands of simple, backward villagers to leave areas where they have lived for centuries. When these poor people flee to other areas, it should be quite obvious that they in turn then infringe upon the territorial rights of other villagers or landowners. This creates violent rioting, or at least sporadic outbreaks of banditry, that last lowly recourse of dying and terrorized people. Then, when the distant government learns of the banditry and rioting, it must offer some safe explanation. The last thing that regional government would want to do would be to say that the huge lumbering or paper interests had driven the people out of their ancestral homeland. In the Philippines, it is customary for the local regional government to get a 10% rake off on all such enterprise and for national politicians to get another 10%. So the safe explanation becomes communist-inspired subversive insurgency. The word for this in the Philippines is huck. In the piece of real estate we now call South Vietnam, the refugee problem that resulted in rioting and incipient banditry was derived from three sources: the huge French rubber plantation holdings on lumbering interests, the mass movement of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese from north of the 17th parallel, and the complete collapse of the ancient rice economy. We included the destruction of potable water resources during the early years of the Diem regime, all came at about the same time to create a terroristic situation among millions of people in what would otherwise have been their ancestral homeland. Again, this was attributed to subversive insurgency inspired by communism. This is a familiar formula in Latin America too, and is found to be at the root of the problem in the emerging nations of Africa. In following chapters, we shall see how the new U.S. Army doctrine that has been developed at the White House by a special presidential committee is designed expressly to meet such situations and to create in those countries a military center of power, bracketing all political, economic, and social activity. In the context of Army policy and committees, two major contributors and authors were both U.S. military generals who were actually the spokesmen for the CIA. The policy that they developed has become the CIA's most effective tool during the counterinsurgency era, which began about 1960 through 61. That's it for chapter. Bit of a mighty chapter today, wasn't it? Whew. We will begin chapter 4. From the world of the law to the interpretation, President Kennedy attempts to put the control. Wait a minute. President Kennedy attempts to put the control. President Kennedy attempts to put the CIA under control. There we go. Yeah, I can't even fucking read, can I?